Day 1, which sets out the special circumstances affecting the setting of the story and tells of Adso's and William's first day at the Abbey. Finally here. Well, as already mentioned, in order to approach a thorough examination of the story of The Name of the Rose, I decided to stick to the structure of the novel. The structure is held after the days that William of Baskerville and Adso of Melk stayed at the Abbey, 7 in all. Then there is an epilogue. A second question I had to ask myself is how I compare the media. One possibility would have been to take the day and look at what happened on that day in the book, in the film and in the series. However, that would have resulted in quite a mess, because the film has to condense the plot of the book into 2 hours and omits some things, while the series also omits some things but edits something in return. The easiest thing is actually to follow the book and then see how the other media have implemented what Umberto Eco has specified. That makes everything a little clearer. An example: in the series we see the Inquisitor Bernard Gui from episode 1 on, first in Avignon with the Pope and then on his journey to the monastery. In the novel, which is told from Adso's first-person perspective, the author naturally doesn't know what's happening in Avignon or on Gui's arrival. If I were to follow the series chronologically alongside the novel, I would have to continually look forward to later chapters of the novel to shed light on what is said about Gui there. It's easier to shed some light on Gui's portrayal in the series once we get to know him in the novel. The same applies to the most important person in the story, the girl. And before I start now, I have to deal with a few general things about the film and series that I have already briefly addressed. Let's start with the main cast. We'll get to other things in due course. In the film, William of Baskerville is portrayed by Sean Connery and Adso of Melk is portrayed by Christian Slater. Of course, Connery fills the room. His appearance has gravitas, as the saying goes. He may not quite match physically Adso's description of his master, more on that later, but he fills the role very well, whether seriousness or humor is called for. Furthermore, it has a particularly humorous note that the man who brought James Bond to life for the screenplay is leading role in this. In fact, Umberto Eco wrote a contribution about James Bond for a book, the essay The Narrative Structures in Fleming's Work, which was published in the book The Case of James Bond 007, a phenomenon of our time in the 1960s. What's more, the author Ursula Schick notices that there's a direct connection between this essay and The Name of the Rose. This opening section, naturally an old manuscript, is set in the empirical author's everyday situation. It takes place between Prague and Buenos Aires in 1968 to 1970 and deals with the discovery of the manuscript that contains Adso's entire story. This story which is assembled from narrative elements that Echo lists in his study of James Bond, is a rather confused game of deception in its mixture of love story, political thriller, scientific documentation and mystifying detective story, with the detective's interest being in a medieval manuscript. The confusion consists in combining absolutely verifiable and empirically or bibliographically correct individual elements with clearly fictitious information in such a way that even the expert reader sometimes loses the overview. Concerning Adso, this is Christian Slater's first major role, and whether it's his talent as an actor or the fact that he was new on the job, it's a wonderful fit. His constant bewilderment about the Abbey and the strange things, and the development the character is going through in the film feels very real. In the series, William is portrayed by John Turturro, known from other series like Miami Vice or Frasier and films like Transformers 3 or The Batman. He comes a little closer to William's description physically and manages to portray his mischievous delight in surprising other people with his logical mind. Damian Hardung as Adso is a young German actor who was only 20 years old at the time the series was filmed. It suits Adso's age, and he also manages to portray Adso's naivete and his transformation well. However, it has to be said that apart from the fact of the additional time and the added material, the character of Adso in the series has a different background, and therefore this development takes place differently than in the film and in the novel. Away from the actors, we come to the music. The approaches of the composers for the film and the series are very different. James Horner rather captured the atmosphere for the film, working with instruments that were more typical of the time but also introduced modern aspects, such as disharmony. The opening piece alone, thumping tones heralding doom, as we hear the voice of old Adso of Melk introducing the film, then intermittent chimes of bells and wordless hymns, is enough for me to get in the mood for the story. Volker Bertelmann, perhaps also known to some by his stage name Hauschka, chose a different approach for the series. His music sounds more medieval and symphonic, but no less threatening. Above all, the title music of the episodes, to which we see matching painted pictures of the main actors, and a spiral of bookshelves winding into infinity, is also very atmospheric. But oh my, I hear the audience calling. Isn't it enough with the introduction? Can we finally start the story? Take it easy, take it easy. There's one more thing left to do before we get started, and that's catching up on some information from Adso's prologue. Here Adso introduces us to the political situation in 1327 and giving us some information of his own history and describes his master, William of Baskerville. The physical appearance of William of Baskerville was so impressive that it would have attracted the attention of even the most distracted observer. His tall frame exceeded that of an ordinary man, and his slenderness made him appear even taller. He had sharp, piercing eyes, and the narrow, slightly hooked nose gave his face an expression of lively alertness, except for those moments of rigidity, of which I shall speak later. His chin also portrayed a strong will. This description is very interesting because here Umberto Eco directly confirms to us, his audience, where he got the inspiration for this investigative duo. It's not a question of could it maybe be that? It's an affirmative yes, that's how it is, because with these words Dr. Watson describes the appearance of Sherlock Holmes in their first adventure. His form and appearance alone were enough to attract the attention of the most casual observer. He was over 6 feet tall and so immensely gaunt that he seemed even taller. His eyes were sharp and penetrating, except during those intermittent periods of paralysis I have mentioned, and his narrow, hawk-like nose gave him an overall expression of alertness and determination. his chin also had the prominence and force that characterizes the decisive man. The fact that Adso and Watson are so phonetically similar is no coincidence, nor is William's Baskerville origin. It's reminiscent of one of Sherlock Holmes' most famous adventures, The Hound of the Baskervilles. In fact, the events of day 1 also have some connection to this adventure, but we'll get to that. Let us turn to Adso and the political events of the 14th century. In the previous episode I already mentioned in the synopsis that in the monastery to which William and Adso are traveling, a convention is to be held between the Franciscans and the Pope. The Franciscan order was founded in 1210 as the Order of the Minor Friars and follows the teaching of founder Francis of Assisi, whose real name was Giovanni, but after a trip to France was nicknamed Francesco, Little Frenchman. He was a follower and knight loyal to the Pope, but after a vision he wanted to live as a monk and atone for his sins. He was very taken with one particular passage in the Bible. "Freely you received, freely you shall give. Do not put gold, silver and copper coins in your belt. Take no store bag with you, no spare shirt, no shoes, no walking sticks, for whoever works is worth his wages." Accordingly, a vow of poverty was imposed on the order, but over time this came into conflict with the official church under the popes. Because in the meantime the churches had accumulated a lot of wealth and estates, and it even came to the point that the Pope saw himself as the supreme authority, who also wanted to have power over worldly things. The emperor should not appoint the bishops, no, the Pope should appoint the emperor. The purpose of the convent in that abbey, whose name it is still better to keep secret, is to clarify the question of whether Jesus had a purse and whether the clothes he wore were his own. But behind this, of course, stands the question of whether the church should be poor and also renounce secular power. The Pope ruling over the church at this time is John XII, and of course he's unwilling to relinquish any power. That's why the Franciscans are a thorn in his side. But the ongoing war against the worldly lords is not going well, and so the Pope tries everything to save his position. As a result of the war, a young Adso came to northern Italy because his father is the Baron of Melk. This raises the question of whether there was a translation error on the part of Echo, because the lords of Melk were not barons but margraves. However, it is absolutely correct that there has been a monastery in Melk since at least the 11th century, and Adso introduces himself as a novice of this monastery. Once in Italy, however, his father had to help with the siege of Pisa, so Adso was placed in the care of the Franciscan monk William of Baskerville, with whom he traveled through the country for some time. Initially, the two visit different monasteries, but then travel rather purposefully towards a monastery that Adso only refers to as the Abbey. Adso also describes William's interest in natural sciences. Among other things, he has an astrolabe with him, which Adso is not quite comfortable with. At first, however, I feared it was some kind of witchcraft and pretended to be asleep when he got up on a clear night to gaze at the stars, with a strange triangle in his hand. To jump straight to the film, there are two scenes in which both William's interest and the distrust that science sometimes generated in these times are expressed. When William and Adso arrive at the monastery, William unpacks his things and puts them on his bed. Shortly thereafter, the abbot knocks on the door, and William throws a cloth over the astrolabe so he cannot see it. Finally, in a later scene, the monk is seen observing the stars using the device. Let's stay with the film. The history and the political situation are hardly touched on in the film. The film begins with the introduction by Adso as an old man who only speaks of how he traveled to this abbey as a young novice in 1327 and that he will now recount the terrible events. The first scene starts right away when William and his novice arrive at the abbey. In the series, the pre-story is expanded and changed in the process. Adso takes part in a battle as a soldier under his father. All the killing seems pointless to him. He says, "There are no just wars. You can't change the world by killing." He demonstratively takes off his weapon robe in front of his father and puts on his monk's habit. In the series, it is also Adso's own drive to enter a convent against his father's wishes. In real life, it was actually not uncommon for the children of nobles to go to convents, which has a pragmatic background. The inheritance of a family fell to the firstborn. The subsequent siblings had to fend for themselves somehow. Going to a monastery was one way to be cared for here. This is the reason why so many influential abbots and bishops were also nobles and liked to intervene in secular politics with nepotism. Since Adso is acting against his father's will here, he is not placed in William's care either, but the young man accidentally meets the Franciscan friar and simply follows him, resulting in the following conversation. "William, why are you following me?" "Adso, you arouse my curiosity." William meets Adso's father and is given the task of representing the emperor's side in the dispute in the monastery. After meeting the Baron of Melk, he accepts Adso as a novice and an adlatus. Although there is one more thing, Adso is a Benedictine. The Benedictines refer to Benedict of Nursia, who lived at the end of the 5th, beginning of the 6th century AD. He established rules for the monastery he founded that still apply to monks today: retreat, chastity, and all of that. In fact, there is a Benedictine monastery in Melk. The fact that a novice and a monk from two different communities interact here comes directly from the novel. As for the story, here the reader can look through the eyes of Adso at a community he doesn't know. In the film, on the other hand, the whole thing was deleted, presumably in order not to spend too much time with explanations, or if it hadn't been addressed, so as to not confuse the viewer too much as to why Adso and William wear different robes. In the film, however, the change of affiliation is not just limited to the robes, it is even explicitly mentioned when talking about heretics. William: Fra Dolcino believed in the poverty of Christ. Adso: we Franciscans do that too. With all that settled, we are finally on our way to the abbey. Adso's narrative is divided into days, so it is only fitting that the two travelers reach their destination on the morning of the first day, as the chronicler notes. It was a clear, late autumn morning towards the end of November. It had snowed a little during the night, and so a fresh white veil, no more than 2 fingers high, covered the ground. It should be added that the days in the story are also structured, which creates sub-chapters. The structures are based on the times of day in a monastery, and for better understanding, these are broken down in the book's glossary. Furthermore, each sub-chapter has a small heading, but not in the classic sense. It is more or less a summary of what the audience can expect in the relevant subchapter, as exemplified here. Prima, in which they arrive at the abbey and Brother William shows great astuteness. So the two monks arrive at the abbey, with Adson having a feeling of unease from the start. He describes the position of the abbey on a rock and the tower of the edificium, which catches his eye immediately, and which we were later to learn contains the library. Just before they reach the abbey gates, they meet a group of monks led by the Celera Remigio Dovaragine. Much to Remigio's amazement and Adso's astonishment, William knows exactly why the group are searching the forest below the monastery. They are looking for the abbot's horse, which has fled. And without having seen it, William knows what it looks like and where it went. After the monks follow William's direction, William explains to his disciple that he saw the horse's tracks in the snow, estimated its size from broken branches, and knew it was brown because he found brown horsehair in the bushes. This scene is the other Sherlock Holmes reminiscence mentioned earlier. In the novel The Hound of the Baskervilles, Holmes deduces the size and appearance of a dog using a walking stick with bite marks on it in a similar fashion. Once at the abbey, William and Adso are welcomed, given a cell, and the cellarer brings them food. Adso is not quite over his master's deduction, and the two philosophize about horses in an existential sense. This conversation might seem a bit strange, but since much later the word horse plays a role in solving a riddle, Echo certainly didn't throw in this discussion unintentionally. After that, the abbot comes in and he and William talk about William's past as an inquisitor. Here it turns out that even as an inquisitor, William relied heavily on his wits rather than listening to the superstitions of others and making judgments only when he was convinced that there was something to be judged. The abbot is now hoping for William's help, for there was an incident at the abbey. A miniaturist, Adelmo of Otranto, was found dead after a storm in the ravine below the east tower of the edificium, but, as William correctly deduces, he was lying below a window that was found closed. Now William has to find out what happened. Since the library is housed in the edificium, William hopes to be able to see it through the investigation, which the abbot forbids him to do. No one is allowed in the library except the librarian and his assistant. The conversation ends when the scream of a pig about to be slaughtered is heard. After the conversation, William and Adso make their way to the abbey church, where William hopes to meet Friar Ubertin of Casale. Adso looks at the church portal, which Echo describes very extensively, as it is based on motifs of the Book of Revelation, a book of the Bible that will play a major role. Adso is jolted out of his contemplation when he and William are approached by a monk whose shape might match all the monsters from the apocalypse that adorn the church door, and who speaks the gibberish of many different languages. Something that sounds like this. Penitentiagite, watch out, Dracoventurus est eating anima tua, la morte super nos. It's one of the lay brothers called Salvatore, but the fact that he uses the word penitentiagite to open his monologue immediately catches William's attention. Noticing this, Salvatore quickly retreats. William and Ubertin meet in the church, which prompts Adso to write about heretics, about friars, and about the life story of said Ubertin of Casale. He and William continue to talk about heretics and that there is often just a small step between ecstatic vision and sinful intoxication. One part of the conversation in particular caught my eye. But I've learned certain things, William. They would gather in the basement at night and take a newborn child and throw it to one another until it died of the shock and the bumps or some other, and whoever last caught it alive, so that it died in his hands, became the head of their sect. And the child's body was torn in pieces, and the parts were trampled and mixed into the flour from which they baked blasphemous hosts. Ubertin, William said firmly. These things were said of the Armenian bishops, the Paulician sect, and the Bogomils centuries ago. This is very reminiscent of later anti-Semitic conspiracy myths, or more recently the myth of children being held captive so that adrenochrome can be extracted from them. So the conspiracy myth is several centuries old, but well, you can use it even in modern time to build up emotions, because it's about children. In the same conversation between William and Hubertin, we also find one of the puns, of which there are probably some in the whole book, all of which will be very difficult to decipher. William tells Hubertin which brothers will take part in the Franciscan delegation. William mentions a few names, including a certain Hugo of Newcastle. When Hubertin doesn't immediately understand, William translates the name into Latin, Hugo of Novo Castrum. And if you turn the castle, castrum, in a house, so new house, and translate this into Italian, well, what do you have? Casa Nova. After this conversation, another one follows, namely with Severin of St. Emmeran, the brother botanist who is extremely familiar with medicinal plants and poisons. But I have to do a remark here. If you are familiar with the book, you might have just said, stop, this is not Severin of St. Emmeran, it's Severin of St. Wendel, isn't it? Well, yes and no. For some reason, Severin got the of St. Wendel only in the English translation. In the original Italian version, it is Severin do St. Emmeran. I don't get why this change is done. They are two completely different monasteries we are talking about. St. Wendel is in Saarland in Germany, and St. Emmeran is in Bavaria. And it's not even, at least in my opinion, that Anglophonians have difficulties with pronouncing St. Emmeran. It's just like St. Wendel, there is no big problem. As I said, I don't get it. Nevertheless, for the rest of this, we will refer to him as Severin of St. Emmeran. Okay, so he is an expert in medicinal plants and poisons. William suspects that the dead Adalmus may have plagued by visions triggered by some herbs. Severin notes that Adalmus, the translator Venantius, and the librarian's assistant Berengar had a good relationship. Then it's time to visit the edificium. The ground floor of this main building is divided into the kitchen and the dining room or refectory. A staircase leads up to the scriptorium, which occupies the whole floor. The librarian Malarkey allows William to look at the table of contents, the codex of the library. Here, William uses his eyeglasses, which arouse astonishment among the copyists present. William finds that the information on where to find the books in the library is encrypted. Then the workplace of the deceased Adalmus is visited, where there is a workpiece, a book page, which he was in the process of designing. It turns out that Adalmus had a talent for funny pictures, causing general laughter, which is interrupted by an angry Jorge. Yes, that's how his name is pronounced, Jorge, who doesn't want that anybody laughs. Jorge is an old, blind Spanish monk who is treated with great respect by everyone. In the following conversation between him and William, there are various hints that neither William nor Adso know how to interpret. Finally, Jorge speaks out about the apocalypse, since there was an Adso of Mont-Andier who spoke of the prophecies being fulfilled at the turn of the millennium. When William points out that the prophecies that the end of the world would come in the year 1000 had not been fulfilled, Jorge replies, "The ways of the Antichrist are long and tortuous. He comes when we least expect him, and not because the apostles' calculations were wrong, but because we have not learned to interpret them. He's already on the way. Don't waste your last days laughing at the silly little monsters with dappled fur and twisted tails. Use the last 7 days." The day draws to a close, and at the end of the tour through the abbey, William and Adso meet Nicholas of Morimont, the abbey's master glazier. He is of course enthusiastic about William's eyeglasses and wants to study them in order to recreate them. The two talk about whether or not knowledge should be made available to the general public, while Nicholas reports that the monastery's library has a protective mechanism that once almost drove a monk who snuck into it insane. Shortly before dinner, William brings Adso up to date on his thoughts. During the tour, he noticed that there had been a landslide at a point below the monastery. He deduces that Adalmo probably jumped off the wall at this point, whereupon his corpse slid further down until it came to rest under the tower of the edificium, where it was found. William follows the rule of his namesake William of Ockham, and in whose lifetime the story takes place. This rule is also known as Ockham's razor and says, when trying to clarify something, it is better to settle for the possibility of fewer facts than on a hypothesis that takes too much speculation. Nevertheless, there's still a mystery. The question is, why? Why did he fall down the wall? During the late service, the two notice that Malachias comes into the church from a side chapel. William deduces that there must be some kind of secret passage to the library, but at the moment he has no interest in sneaking into the library, since he knows that Adalmus didn't fall out of the window there. The both then go to rest, and that's the end of the first day. Now let's take a closer look at the adaptation and begin with the film. The whole introduction about the abbot's horse is missing here. William will prove his wits a little later in two ways. First, more humorously, when he sees Adson shifting from one foot to the other and realizes what is troubling the novice. Adson, in order to master nature, one must first learn to obey it. Then the monk describes a way how to find the toilets of the monastery. When Adso asks how he knew since he had never been here, the answer is, when we arrived, I saw a brother running there in great hurry, but he came back much more slowly, and a look of some relief on his face. The second occasion shows the more serious side of William's ability. The abbot comes into the cell and they have a small talk. But William can very clearly see that something is bothering the abbot. When apparently out of nowhere, William suddenly expresses his condolences because the monastery had recently lost a brother. The abbot is excited and wants to know how William knew that. Well, simple. William has seen the fresh grave that's being visited by a couple of crows through the window of the cell. They then speak of the death of Adalmus, and the information is pretty the same as in the novel. William meets Ubertine of Casale, but the conversation in the movie is greatly abbreviated and adapted to the medium. Movie says, show don't tell. While Ubertine speaks contemptuously of Adalmus, who had something feminine about him, the lascivious eyes of a woman, he takes Adso to the statue of St. Mary and gently strokes the back of his head. That is William's quote, that it is only a small step between ecstatic vision and sinful intoxication, captured in a picture. William discovers that Adalmus may have jumped from the wall during a visit to the slope in question, during which he and Adso witness the abbey disposing of kitchen waste through an opening, and they see how the residents of a village at the foot of the monastery are fighting for the waste. The scene in the scriptorium can also be found, albeit heavily cut. In addition, Malachias behaves much more dismissively than in the novel. There's also an additional scene before when William and Adso arrive at the monastery. The abbot, Malachias and Jorge are in a room together. The abbot asks if he, William, should be told it, to which Malachias strictly says no and Jorge abstains. So there is more confrontation built up here from the start. The librarian's assistant Berengar, unlike in the novel, has no real text throughout the film. He either remains silent or screams when a mouse startles him in the scriptorium. He jumps onto a chair. This triggers laughter, which in turn provokes Jorge's appearance. We hear him sing once and notice that he has a very high-pitched voice and that tears are coming from his eyes. At dinner, the abbot already thanks Brother William for clearing up the mystery of the sudden death of Adalmus. So in the film, the motive for Adalmus' suicide remains secondary in the first place. This is somewhat inconsistent because if, according to William's deduction, the abbot is also of the opinion that Adalmus committed suicide, the monks would have been obliged to exhume his body and bury it outside of the cemetery. The series follows the novel a little more precisely, at least for the events that are directly taken out of the novel. The scene with the runaway horse is found as well as the longer conversation between William and the abbot. In contrast to the film, the abbot wants William to solve the crime directly, as in the novel. However, Adalmus did not find his death a few days ago, but his shattered body is being taken to the abbey when William and Adso arrive. At the point where William speaks to Ubertine in the novel, the funeral mass for Adalmus has taken place. Adso is already looking at the portal here, but without William and without Salvatore appearing. Like in the film, William and Adso are climbing around the slopes beneath the abbey to find out that Adalmus had jumped from the wall. This is followed by the scene in the scriptorium, which follows the book a little more closely, but is also shortened. And now follows the scene where Adso meets Salvatore at the church portal. After dinner, William and Adso have a conversation that sheds light on the political dimension of the dispute. The first day ends here. The conversation with the master glazer Nicholas takes place on another day, and we don't see Malachias coming through a secret passage from the library to the church. To wrap up this lengthy episode, let's talk about the performers in the other roles. For the film production, it was very important that the actors appear as realistic as possible, adapted to the time in which the film takes place. As director Jean-Jacques Annaud said in an interview, "As a rule, I recommended that the make-up artists proceed the other way around with this film than they are used to. Instead of covering up the ugliness and bumps of a face, they should emphasize and even reinforce these areas. The reason for all this is not that I wanted a cabinet of exotic animals in front of the camera, but that healthcare in the Middle Ages was extremely problematic. Diseases could only rarely be cured, and those who survived them always had physical traces of them. Therefore, all actors had also to remove their dentures and false teeth." This ambition is immediately apparent in the film. The Middle Ages of the film seem tangible and dirty. A lot of effort has been put into the series as well, but it stays a little too clean. In my opinion, you notice this very clearly with the girl, which we talk about later. Speaking of talking, let's talk about the other characters and their cast, starting with Ubertine de Casale. This is a real character. He was alive at the time of when the novel takes place and has written a number of writings critical of the Pope. In the film, he's portrayed by William Hickey and fits the description and the demeanor very closely. There's nothing to say about the series here. Ubertine does not appear there. He has been completely removed from the plot. Remigius of Voragine is the first monk of the abbey that William and Adso encounter. In the film, he is portrayed by the character actor Helmut Gwaltinger, who portrays the character very well. Remigius indulges in pleasure, and you can see that. The actor in the series is Fabrizio Bentivoglio, who is a bit too thin for the bon vivant Remigius. However, this also has to do with the fact that Remigius takes part in a slightly different story arc in the series than in the film. There, the cellarer has made himself comfortable at his post. In the series, he's plagued by his conscience. As for Salvatore, I think Stefano Fresi in the series had a harder time standing up to Ron Perlman from the movie anyway. Alone from the look, it makes a big difference, and the Americans' over-the-top acting does the rest. Also, the mask Perlman was given fits the description in the novel better. In addition, the story arc for his characters in the series has also been changed significantly. Now I've spoken twice against the series, here's something positive: the abbot, who by the way also has a name, Abbo of Fosanova, but this name isn't mentioned in either the series or the film. In the series, Michael Emerson fits the novel model much better than Michael Lonsdale in the film. The abbot in the story is only a apparent lord of the abbey and knows it, and Emerson can make this uncertainty very clear. Lonsdale is far too much in control of the situation. In one scene he even reminds me very much of the arrogant demeanor of another role he played, namely that of the villain Hugo Drax from the James Bond movie Moonraker. As for Berengar of Arundel, I'm not quite sure why Michael Habeck was cast in the film. He can hardly make use of his acting talent, since the character, as already mentioned, stays silent most of the time and doesn't have much to do else either. Was it because of his unusual appearance, which was enhanced by almost white makeup? From the production notes I can only understand that he also had to shave off all his body hair. Thinking in evil direction, maybe that was the cliché the producers had in mind given Berengar's homosexuality. The model in the novel doesn't give much, because in the foreword Adso writes that he won't bother describing the appearance of every person who appears in the story. The description of Berengar is limited to one sentence: a pale-faced young monk who, just looking at him, made me think of what Ubertin had said about the dead Adelmus. His eyes were like those of a lustful woman. Maurizio Lombardi portrays Berengar differently in the series, and not so much attention is paid to an extremely unusual appearance. However, to my shame, I have to admit that when I saw this actor for the first time, I immediately thought of Jim Parsons, who plays Dr. Sheldon Cooper in the series The Big Bang Theory, if you're familiar with that. Maybe it's not just me, hopefully. Malachi or Malachias of Hildesheim, the librarian, is better portrayed in the film with Volker Prechtel, even if the aggressive mood that prevails there doesn't quite match the original. And although Richard Sammel does not quite fit the physical appearance of Malachias, he delivers a stunning performance and the mood is more like in the novel. He's not as hostile from the beginning as in the movie. We will talk about his acting later on in this series when we talk about scenes that did not make it into the movie. As for Jorge of Burgos, I can't decide. Both Fyodor Chelyapin in the film and James Cosmo in the series give a wonderful portrayal of the blind monk who despises laughter and thinks it's a tool of the devil. Also, I can't make up my mind about the actors who played Severin of Sankt Emmeram, Elia Baskin in the film and Piotr Adamczyk in the series. Severin is also portrayed in a rather humorous way in the film, for example when he grins happily when it is said that a corpse has to be taken care of. Adamczyk is more serious and seriously interested in research. Last but not least, the master glazer Nicholas of Morimont, a role that does not appear in the movie. The whole storyline about this monk's fascination with William's eyeglasses and his attempt to reproduce them has completely been omitted here. In the series, he is portrayed by Fausto Maria Schiarappa and fits in with his role model in the novel. Wow, this was a long affair for the first day. My head is pounding. Oh, how good that I found my own loculus here in this monastery, to which I can withdraw for today. The librarian was very helpful in my search, unlike other librarians. I'll have to take a closer look at the library some other time. Because, what did the librarian say? Strange things happened here too? Yes, he said that. But that is another story, To be told another time.